So this talk is going to be about what this merge of taking Dust from that state as running on a developer's machine to running on Tranquility, what did that mean to the people in operations? What did that mean to the people running the servers? What did it mean to the developers that we dragged into this whole process? And what were the kind of problems we encountered, and how did we actually change the company and change the way we thought about doing dev and ops to fix this? Oh, that was zoom in. There we go. I need to zoom out now. So, my name is James. I'm the tech lead for Dust 514 infrastructure, and you might also recognize me from previous rock band competitions at Fanfest as CCP Mindstar. And with me today I've got Jonas, CCP Lopi. Yep. Lopi is Icelandic for yarn, for those who didn't know. And he's a technical lead for service infrastructure, which is a kind of a nebulous way of describing DevOps at CCP. So a little bit about me, for those that don't know me. I've been at CCP for around 6 years now. And I've worked in a lot of different places. I came on board originally as an intern in customer support, working as a GM. I made my way into QA, where I learned how to develop the game and test software. And then finally, for the last 4 years or so, I've been working directly in the operations team, where I spent about 3 years as a sysadmin on the Eve cluster, working on things like web projects, implementing new code into the cluster, and specifically helping the operations guys focus on interacting a bit more closely with QA and the dev process. And now for the last couple of years, I've been actually working specifically just on Dust as one of the kind of key members of the ops team. I got sent out to Shanghai all on my own to be the only operations guy out there and try and kind of wrangle the development team there into thinking not just about, okay, well, we're just going to run Dust on our workstation and that works fine, to, okay, so in about 6 months, you're going to have to run this on hundreds of servers all around the world. So here are some extra things that you might need to think about as you go about your daily life. And so I've got Jonas with me. Yep. Jonas, tell me a bit about yourself.
Sure, why not? or them, at least. So, yeah, my name is Jonas. I'm starting my 3rd year now at GCP, I think. I can't count. I started in the Eve client and server those 3 years ago. And I actually started working on Eve Gate, if anyone uses that. It's actually a nice product. Then I moved off to doing the offline portrait rendering farm that we had in Kana, and integration of that portraits into the Eve client. And after that, I was working on Crest, which is an awesome thing. It's the HTTP interface to the Eve cluster. And we actually introduced some Linux components into the system there. And now I'm tech leading the DevOps effort that is happening within the company. It's an awesome thing. Yes.
DevOps is awesome. So it's interesting you mentioned Crest there, Jonas. Has anyone here been following the dev track over the last couple of days? Yeah? It's pretty exciting stuff. I think once I came across this from operations land and saw what it was all about, and kind of taking the kind of 2003 version of how to do web infrastructure and then replacing it with the 2012 version of how to do web infrastructure is really cool. And trying to bolt that onto an old existing legacy infrastructure has been fun, to say the least. But I think we're certainly making huge amounts of progress along the way there. So, just quickly, what's the difference between a developer and an operations guy? Well, we like to think of our developers as kind of the perspective. This is kind of like we both picked these pictures as our view of each other. So I kind of think of developers as like hipster babies, right? They kind of they think they're really cool, and they don't necessarily know a lot about what the real world is to me. So developers at CCP, they're focused. Their goals in life are to make cool new game features, write code, test code, and ultimately that results in a package that gets sent to operations for deployment to servers. And sometimes that works, often it doesn't. And so that kind of leads us to that view of the development side. And I guess the only way to describe the general view of the operations team at CCP is this picture of this dude here. We actually went on a little weekend away last weekend with the ops team, and this guy would have been right at home. But yeah, so the ops guys, we're in charge of managing the infrastructure. Obviously, our main concerns in life are how many servers do we need, where do we need to put them, and especially for Dust. I mean, where in the world should we put them? Dust is an FPS game, so latency is really important, and these are some concerns that have come up for the operations team over the last year that we haven't really had to be so focused on with Eve. So we buy servers, we build servers, we decide where they're going to be put, and ultimately we also operate the live environment. And so we're responsible for taking these packages that the software teams deploy, unpacking them on our servers, running some configuration, and then kind of seeing if it works or not.
Yeah. So the history is, us at CCP, we've been developing everything inside a huge box, which we call the monolith. We actually reference it, the monolith now. We didn't in the past. It's been awesome. It's a huge luxury just having a single client. Nothing needs to be versioned. We can just deploy whenever we like. We don't have to think about other clients. We can have a downtime, and then just everything is deployed and bring everything up again. Which is why this luxury led to the fact that everything was really simple. We could just double-click an exe file, everything worked on our computers. Nice. That also meant that everything ended up in that monolith. We never built anything outside it. It meant that we just wrote everything into that monolith, and everything just worked. Yes.
Yeah, kind of 10 years of sinning in that infrastructure,
really,
you might say.
It's a box that contains 10 years of legacy. For us, the developers, it also meant that we couldn't bring in new fancy toys, which annoyed people when they started working here.
Yeah, it became it's almost like it slowed down how fast we were developing at CCP, because all of these, to deploy a piece of code or a piece of new cool code meant that you had to work out how that integrated with the entire monolith, the entirety of EVE Online. You had to test the interaction between every single possible combination of circumstances, then make sure that your release schedule aligned with everyone else, build the right software, and then finally it would get put out. And that's kind of the story of the what you might call the 6 or 12-month expansion cycle, where new tech and new features are actually incredibly hard to get out once you've got a lot of things happening inside the big black box.
Yeah, and 4 hours of downtime when we deployed new things.
Yeah, which brings us to my favorite picture on the internet. This really kind of sums up years of working in operations for me. Developers develop stuff, operations operate stuff, and the art of throwing the code that I've built as a developer over the wall to operations is, as far as I'm concerned, that's my responsibility done. I built the code, I tested it on my machine, works, awesome. Someone else's problem now. So in monolith land, when we have Eve as one product, as one exe file, as one configurable software package, this kind of actually, it worked for CCP for a number of years. It wasn't perfect. It certainly had its problems, but it was manageable. The operations team were of a size where we could manage manually configuring this software package. We could manage troubleshooting it in a few hours rather than a few days, because ultimately there weren't too many moving parts on the configuration side, and so it was working out. And so the devs were able to keep throwing this stuff over the wall. But kind of the overall result of that is that the mindset of software developers becomes that they're very specialized. They think only about the code that they're working on, or kind of the general area around them. And in a very complex environment, that can get it can get very difficult for developers to really see the huge picture of a very complex architecture, which is kind of where we're heading. And so the ops guys often end up solving problems resulting from kind of lack of big picture and on the development side of things, and it makes it a bit hard to know who to call sometimes when there's problems. If the monolith breaks, no one really knows which part of it broke. And so often, one of the things to note as well about the operations team is that generally we're specialized in servers and we want to know about servers. So when it comes to detailed debugging of something that's happening in the application, it's generally something that we call developers in for. And if it's happening at 3 o'clock in the morning, the developers certainly aren't happy, because devs don't like to be on call, not like ops guys.
Just don't answer the phone like I do.
Yeah, and then you have an hour or two of extra downtime as you locate Jonas's boss, and he drives to Jonas's place and wakes him up.
Everything really close by, so that's good.
And so then Dust 514 came along. And not just Dust 514, but Dust 514 is obviously, it's a trailblazer for this new style of architecture, taking Eve from the 2003 model of being a web service to the 2012 model, which is much more based around standardized technologies. And what that resulted in for the operations team is suddenly not just the monolith that we have to manage, but we have to manage all of this stuff that's now coming alongside the monolith to help make Dust work, to help make Crest work. And so we've got the Crest API, which is running on Linux. Linux, as many of you will probably notice, is not something that has traditionally been a strong area within CCP. We've generally been running pretty much our entire stack on Windows. Using multiple new web services, all of which require to be highly available, scalable, performance tested, and online. Moving the authentication system outside of the Eve cluster to the single sign-on platform, so that other clients that are not the Eve client are able to authenticate with the Eve cluster. That requires a web service, that requires configuration, that requires servers, that requires all kinds of stuff. Similarly, integration with the PlayStation 3 platform, the Sony Entertainment Network, which used to be called PSN. They have, we have our own integration with them for the virtual goods service within Dust. When you buy something on the PlayStation Network for Dust, that requires calls to our servers. It requires our servers to be online and working. And so again, that's another thing that now has to be configured, available online all the time. It's a move towards this kind of much more service-oriented architecture. And where previously in monolith land, all the services live inside one executable, now they live as completely separate services which are deployable separately, upgradable separately, and they all depend upon each other. And so that can introduce all kinds of complex dependencies and make troubleshooting and setting all of this stuff up really, really, really hard. Of course, we've also got big data. This is yet another buzzword, but in Dust, we're of course really, really motivated by collecting large amounts of data, so we can have ultimately we want to be able to put something like the Office 97 paperclip in your face and say, you look like you've died 10 times in a row. You might want to invest in shield hardeners. So this kind of stuff is really is really adding to this huge complexity that the operations team have to deal with. And we don't just have to deal with it once, because Tranquility is one server, but for Dust and for Eve, we have multiple test servers that get managed, usually by the operations team. And so suddenly, not once, but 10 times or 15 times over, we actually have to set up, configure, and troubleshoot all of these services. And last year, when we started doing this, we realized it was taking us 2-3 weeks at a time to actually get a piece of infrastructure set up. And the devs were helpful enough to introduce some very kind of dirty hacks to get around it, to make it work in developer land, but it didn't really. Yeah, thanks, Jonas. We're still untangling these replacement hacked versions of the SSO that live inside the Eve server. But ultimately, we've have this really complex pipeline that we've had to get around. And so what we did as a company is we actually restructured a bit, yet another reorganization inside the company, but we've developed this group called New Eden Services. New Eden Services mandate is to focus specifically on the back-end platform which Eve and Dust run on top of. And the goal of this platform is to allow the Dust product group and the Eve product group simply to focus on making games. They don't need to know how to set up a cluster. They don't need to know the intricacies of connecting a lot of these back-end pieces of infrastructure like login and authentication and CREST. They just want to know is that when they make a call to the CREST endpoint for their new feature, that something comes back and it all works. And so New Eden's goal is to kind of make that happen. And for a large part of that, that's where Jonas's team comes in.
Yep. So what actually happened is like when New Eden Services was formed, that meant that ops and devs were sitting under the same roof, which meant that we were kind of working on the same problems. We're just doing it from different angles. They were trying to deploy all of this complexity. We were trying to develop in all of this complexity, meaning that like both ends were trying to operate within this very complex system. So it kind of merged into one, dev and ops, which incidentally forms a word called DevOps, which is a hot new buzzword. And
you always have to do talks about hot new buzzwords.
Yeah,
it's
and you have to follow them in companies.
And if you work with a gentleman named Vignir in your presentations, everyone wave to Vignir. You have to include a picture of a kitten. Vignir likes kittens.
So what we've been doing in the DevOps world of CCP, we've been creating all of these fancy tools, which we really like. We have a private cloud really now within CCP. We're kind of our own cloud provider. So you can just push a button, and what you get back is a fully operational Eve cluster. Well, it's at least a bunch of virtual machines, but they're not operating. So we have to script deployments. So now we have a web page that you go to, you can just push a button, and it deploys everything onto it. At that point, you have a fully functional Eve cluster. So we automated or scripted all the deployments in Python, like everything else in this company. We use a module called Fabric, which is pretty awesome, with a lot of Windows extensions, because we operate a lot of Windows things, while everything else seems to be built around Linux. And there are a lot of other interesting things that we had to solve, like we had to standardize all builds within the company, because now we're deploying these builds, we have to be able to fetch them from somewhere. And we also have like we have offices in Shanghai, Newcastle, Atlanta, Reykjavik, so builds can origin from wherever. So we have to build our own CDN just for builds to distribute these builds geographically like around the world and have them all cast and nice things.
Yeah. So for instance, when a developer wants to create a new instance of a Eve Dust full stack cluster environment, they might actually be pulling a build that was created in Shanghai this morning, a build that was created in Reykjavik today, and those get automatically combined by this one system onto a virtual machine, which we call, or a number of virtual machines, which we call a slice internally. We slice it and dice it, and within minutes they have a running cluster.
Minutes.
Hours, minutes.
Yes.
It's getting better.
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, we have like all of these configurations. They're now happening in code. Each developer that is creating some kind of service, he actually creates the way to deploy these services now onto a cluster. So we have repeatable deployments. If we deploy this once in development, it will be the same in testing, it will be the same in production. So deployments now, they should only fail once, which is in deployment. When you get up to testing, especially production, they're not going to fail. We've done this a million times before.
And this is a strategy actually that we've used multiple times, not just within automation, but within the last year or so of development of Dust, as we've taken these products from being two completely separate products, one live, one in development. And how many of you guys were playing during the Dust beta? Was anyone involved in that? Yeah, a few people. So you guys probably noticed the times where we took Dust from its own server and merged it onto the main Eve test server Singularity, and then later on moved that on from Singularity to Tranquility. And each time we did that, we rehearsed these really complex migrations multiple times, because it's just so important when you're doing these deployments that you practice them, and especially with automation as well. If you're able to make your deployments fail in tests rather than in the live environment, it's only a good thing.
Yeah, and actually with the Dust deployment on TQ, we had everything pretty much deployed to TQ like multiple days before. The only thing that we had to wait for was like database migrations.
Yeah. So it's just an important side note there is that you really practicing all of your deployments before you actually run them for the first time in a live environment is great.
Yeah.
So we've got a few screenshots here now of a couple of the tools that we've been working on, the ones that we find a little bit interesting. So Jonas owns some slices.
Yeah, this is the bakery where you can go and create yourself new slices or new Eve clusters just with a push of a button. It's created by Vignir. Aha. Then we have one-click deployments.
Trogdor the deployinator.
Yes, you just push the big blue button, and what you get back is like fully deployed cluster.
And this is
pretty awesome.
This, I've got to say, that, like this screen here, it like represented such a huge step for CCP. Like this setup host button. If you just give it a vanilla Windows host and you say, I want this to run single sign-on, I want this to run virtual goods server, and I want it now. You just hit the blue setup host button and it checks if the server's got the web server installed, configures it, adds all the code from the right versions of the applications, deploys them, sets them up, puts them online, and then very quickly you end up with a working server. One click. It's really, really, really important. I mean, certainly all the guys that are sitting up the back there, the operations team have been having a lot of fun with this tool.
Lot of fun.
And importantly as well, for a developer, someone that is actually trying to set up a development environment so that they can just work on their own. Maybe they have a new feature in Eve that they want to develop. Eve doesn't work now without all of these extra services, without all of these extra bits that we've added. It's a completely integrated backend that runs Eve and Dust. And so for an Eve developer to make a feature and know that it's working, they actually need to have all of this stuff in their local development environment. And so for them, they don't have to know what an SSO is if all they want to do is make spaceships. But if they hit the blue setup host button, they've got it, and they don't need to know anything more. And then on the other side, because we all like pretty graphs and pretty pictures, we've implemented, this is another example of one of the tools that we've put in place. This is a dashboard coming out of our kind of real-time logging and analytics platform called Splunk. And this allows us to see to the minute what's going on across our cluster. And this is another example of kind of a back-end service that New Eden services can provide to teams like Dust and teams like Eve, where the Dust guys know that they need to know how many battles were started, where were they started, how is my battle cluster doing, but they don't necessarily want to know the intricacies of how to plumb getting logs from a battle server in Sydney through to London, store it somewhere, and then make a dashboard to make it pretty. And so it's an example of another service where New Eden Services has taken that back-end plumbing and helped the product teams get meaningful information out of the server. This is my favorite thing. We've got a dashboard in the operations team where we can see over the last few minutes how many players have been joining battles and where they've been coming from. It's just a nice little example of kind of the live information that the analytics tools you can do these days get you. So when we see forum posts from people saying, I live in North Carolina and I can't connect to Dust, we can actually go and check right down to that state in the US and see if there's any players experiencing problems there. So
even filter on ISPs and figure out, it's actually this ISP that is having trouble.
Exactly.
Call them up.
Yeah, and so it's a real step forward because this kind of stuff now is automatically built into all of the Eve clusters and Dust clusters that we have, and developers and operations people too can just use them. And it's early days yet for us. The tool set is still kind of coming in hot, but it means that where we're going is that people will be able to be a lot quicker about the way they're developing things. And so we have this kind of paradigm shift happening where everyone's starting to get really happy at CCP. Developers are empowered to manage their own services and to really just focus on what they do best. It's much simpler to set up and tear down environments and test environments, and so we can focus less on how do we configure a cluster? How do we configure this service environment that we live in? And more focus on how do we develop cool stuff and how do we make it faster? No, but that's me. And so once again, it's taken us full circle, and we're starting to get back to the point now where the operations team, having gone through a year of pretty complex manual labor in terms of setting up and constantly introducing new services and manual environment changes, we're back at a point now where the operations team are once again just helping click the deploy button on a few select servers that we manage and focusing more on what operations do best, which is providing infrastructure, providing servers, making sure that the servers are working really well and in the right place. And so that's kind of where we've gotten to, and it's a journey we've been taking. It's been pretty good, but we're continuing down this road.
Yeah. So if you guys like this DevOps thing, this is actually the Bible. We read this book chapter by chapter and then implemented those things in that sequence. There's actually a fictional novel called The Phoenix Project that is highly recommended for everyone in IT. Just read it, because it tells you exactly like what is wrong with some companies and how to fix it, but in a like fun way.
It's awesome. I hate reading like really dry technical books. Like, you know, this is a good example of service configuration. But this is actually like a story. It reads like a story, and stuff happens in it, and it's fun. So it's actually a really good one to read. The Phoenix Project.
And then Tumblr, of course, with the DevOps reactions.
If you guys haven't seen that site, it's hilarious. It's all kinds of just really random animated GIFs. It's great.
Like every day there is something funny there. And then DevOps Borat on Twitter. He's really helpful. Good insights there.
Yes.
And then we're going to be writing some devlogs this year on all of this stuff. In-depth coverage of how we're doing DevOps within CCP. I think that's going to be interesting for both the players and also just people outside of CCP. How to do DevOps in legacy systems.
Yep. So that's kind of the end of all the slides for us. So it's time for questions. Has anyone got any questions or interesting bits? Have we actually? Yep. Oh, Thor with the microphone. Excellent.
So it sounds like you guys are actually doing virtualization on your own hardware internally.
Yes.
And so why not evaluate any kind of external hosting like EC2 or SoftLayer or anything like that?
Yeah. Good question.
We are actually constantly evaluating that. We've had a virtualization infrastructure within CCP for a number of years. Internally, within our Office IT environment, we have most of it actually is running in a VMware cloud. And as we've come down this road over the last year or so, there's been a more and more emphasis in putting effectively cloud infrastructure in place for development. And what started off as a few extra virtual machines on top of our existing cloud is now, you know, half of it or an entire separate cloud. And we're actually even now constantly looking at, is this the right way to go? Do we want to be running this as our own private internal cloud, or at what point does it make sense for us to just start running this in a public cloud or in a private instance within a hosted infrastructure? But an example of that is that our battle server hosting strategy is much more focused on utilizing infrastructure as a service companies. So for the Eve cluster, for those that don't know, is completely owned and operated from the kind of the data center space upwards by CCP. So we buy the hardware, we move it there, we plug it in, we plug the power in and manage it from that layer up. But for the battle servers and for the actual kind of Dust hosting around the world, we decided to go with a managed service model. So we don't actually own the servers for Dust, we rent them. And this makes it a lot more flexible for us to be agile with the infrastructure, so that if we find we need more servers in a particular place, it's not a massive project for us to add lots of capacity in a really short time, which is what we're going to be doing over the next short while as we kind of ramp up for the release of the next build of Dust.
And then I had one more question about the DevOps. Is DevOps is just kind of a philosophy that you guys are trying to adopt across the company? Is that also kind of fostering chipping away at the monolith and pulling things out to more distributed concept?
Yes, it is. But slowly, like we just have to identify what things we want to break out of it. But it has been applied more in the sense that we don't build new things into it, like the SSO and the virtual goods store. These are things that we could have shoved into that monolith, but we decided it's probably best to go a different route, bring things like new things to be built outside it, so we don't have everything in it in the future.
Thanks.
But yeah, of course, we should be bringing some of the things that are currently in the monolith out, so they don't have the same downtime. And
it's been actually likened by one of the other guys here. It's the concept is called shaving the yak.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, you know, you don't walk up to this massive shaggy beast and start shaving it with your straight razor. You kind of pick a leg and start working on that bit, and then eventually you can start, you know, pulling off the other bits. Other questions?
So, is this a good or a bad time to go into some details about maybe more specifics about how you're doing configuration management? Are you guys pulling in pieces of things like Chef, CDist, Puppet, or should I try to find?
Oh, we can talk about some of that stuff. Do you want to talk about this, Jonas?
Yeah,
or shall I?
sure. So we actually we evaluated using Chef and Puppet first, but the thing is we're highly Windows oriented at the moment. So these things were not supporting Windows that well at that point when we started.
Probably still don't. So
yeah. So we ended up just using Fabric and putting all the configuration part, like saying this service should look like this, into YAML files that describe that this service should really have these components installed on it. And then we just store, like, does it actually have IIS installed on it? And we just read that, and we know, like, yeah, it has the right configuration. So that bit is something that we actually just built on top of Fabric.
Yeah. So we've kind of we've looked at the models that Chef and Puppet have, and well, I mean, one of the drawbacks for us was the lack of Windows support, and the other things as well is that internally at CCP we're really strong in Python, in Python coding, and so going with Fabric and the kind of the Cuisine tool set that runs on top of that as well for some aspects. And certainly with the desire to put more of the individual configuration into the hands of developers, it made a lot of sense to do that in Python rather than in something like Ruby.
Yeah. Even though I use Ruby a lot, pushing that onto like the company as a whole is probably not the best idea.
We've got a lot of special snowflakes pushing things like, you know, Ruby. I think there's someone trying to get Go on the line. You know,
that might be a good idea. And Ruby is awesome, but like, pick your battles. That's probably the best thing here. So like, if everyone knows Python, it's probably best to get them to use Python.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's another question down here, and
yeah, I had a similar question on how you handle configuration management. Do you have a sort of a CMDB, or does Fabric handle that for you?
Yes, we didn't go into that. We didn't want to touch upon that because it's always complex. But we have these configuration files that us, the developers, really change. And then we move these configuration or changes towards production by saying, like, yeah, these changes should now go into testing. And from that, they should go into staging and then into production. Okay. So we push the changes or these configuration files using just source control. Things are just checked in the perforce, and we integrate them between different branches.
Okay, and you're using Jenkins for the deployment there?
No, we're actually, like, we have the website that we showed you for deployment, but we use Jenkins for continuously building all of the packages that we need to deploy.
Right, thank you.
Or the web teams actually use TeamCity for some of it. And interestingly enough, the Shanghai teams, they have TeamCity running as a build server and call it Bamboo, which is another build server from Atlassian. It's a funny joke if you into this.
Wait, so is the build server Bamboo or TeamCity?
No, it's TeamCity. They call it Bamboo. It's not confusing at all.
So you mentioned continuous delivery. How close are you to doing actual continuous delivery?
Well,
I think it depends a lot on the team. Like,
some people are actually just deploying to all servers except production by themselves. but we're not at the point where we just check in and things are deployed if they
work.
if they actually
Yeah.
pass all the tests. So this is really different. We have like a 2-hour feedback loop on the deployment tools because we set up a whole cluster, we test if it works, and then deploy it if the lights are all green at the end. So the deployment pipeline there is pretty long. But yeah,
it's a direction that we're going, but obviously a lot of this is still new, still in motion, and to do something like that, it requires the groundwork to be laid. It requires the actual tool set that supports continuous delivery in place. And so a lot of this focus has been getting those tools in place, has been getting the mindset in place that this stuff can be done, because for a lot of people, a lot of these concepts are very, very new. And so making people simply aware, hey, this can be done. People are doing this now. Look at companies like Facebook. They're doing these things, but then taking that into a company where you're not doing those things, and there's certainly a period of time where people say, okay, they're doing it, and then, okay, so how can we do it? What do we need to put in place? And so now we've come a long way down the line of putting these things in place, and the next step will be to start circulating a lot more of these processes out to allow it.
If you need any inspiration, there's a company in the Valley called Wealthfront who does financial software. And they actually have complete developer empowerment. So the moment they commit their code, it actually rolls directly through, all the test loops, and it rolls directly out to production as well, and there will be a lot of analytical work being done on the actual production code, stuff like how many 404s do we experience, and all all that kind of shit. And then it will either stay in production or roll back depending on how it reacts.
There's another company a few of us have been following closely that's doing similar things there, which is Etsy. They've been doing awesome stuff. They're kind of the home handcrafted version of eBay, and they've got an excellent blog called Coder's Craft, which focuses on a lot of these topics, and it's well worth reading.
And then you have it's my phone reminding me of going home from work. Then we have blew me off. I don't even know what I'm talking about.
We're talking about Etsy and Coder's Craft.
Then you have other things in our company, like marketing. I haven't gone up to marketing yet and told them we should shorten our releases and just release new features every day. I don't know how that works. Maybe they would like it, maybe they wouldn't, but that's a discussion that I'm not willing to have with them. And I'm gonna tell them, hey, you have the capabilities to do it, but it's up to them if they wanna really release every week or every day or whatever.
So you briefly said it, you mentioned that you didn't have any versioning with the monolith, which makes sense.
Yeah.
But now I'm assuming you have introduced versioning, and so there's versioning on the service interfaces, and I'm assuming there's also versioning for the data itself. How do the devs now have to deal with any kind of data migration that has to happen, and how does that affect deploying your clusters?
So, that's a good question. The thing is, it's only versioned in Crest, which is the HTTP interface on top of the Eve cluster. The Matchanet interfaces are still not versioned, and we don't really need to think about it. It's only the Eve client that is calling into that. So maybe at some point it will make sense to move the Eve client to use Crest. That's an ongoing discussion. But this really, then becomes more of a question, how do we do versioning in Crest? I think we had a 2-hour talk on that yesterday or something. So, it was probably awesome.
I think this gentleman did you have a question? Yeah. Okay, another one over here.
You already kind of touched on this on the first question, but I'm wondering, you mentioned you have a lot of networking infrastructure, like your own CDN, etc., and obviously all of the networking that goes with the servers.
Yeah.
So do you also manage that in-house yourself, or do you just purchase networking services as a whole?
So what we have in-house is we have effectively there's kind of two subsets. We've got our own corporate infrastructure that interconnects all of the offices. So we have our own private WAN and private routing infrastructure that we manage ourselves. We've got a team of network admins that focus on that. That provides connectivity between the office. And then that integrates as well into our production environment, which is where the Eve cluster is hosted in a data center in London. And we also we buy capacity from tier 1 and 2 providers in London and connect that directly to the infrastructure. And also then have a link out to our hosted infrastructure, which is more where we're buying the managed services. When we go out to our hosted infrastructure, where we're running things like our battle servers and some of the ancillary services for Dust, that's more a case of we call up a hosting company and say we need a server, and they handle everything below that.
But on top of that, we have the CDN that we built by just picking off-the-shelf solutions like Varnish for caching, and like we use FTP servers for storing whatever builds we need, and then web servers serving that out. We just pick nice solutions, put it together in one package, and then we deploy them using this deployment console.
Yeah, and so that's nice. Actually, just to extend on that, the on top of that networking topology, this is this internal caching CDN that we run. So that's actually purely just internally facing. So in each of these locations around the world, in each office, in each data center, and even in each hosting center that we have Dust servers in, we actually have replicas or cache servers of which have access back into the internal infrastructure to deliver internal builds out to our test and production servers.
And then the second part, because you mentioned you are constantly evaluating this, but so you basically just buy transit, other than for the Dust servers which you rent.
Yeah.
But would you say this is more of a legacy thing, or has this actually been working out great for you, having your own, networking department and doing all networking in-house?
It's worked great for us for the last 10 years, definitely. I mean, the place that Eve has come from over 10 years has been that when Eve was launched, and certainly for the first 7 or 8 years, it was doing stuff that was really out on the limits of what people were doing in terms of hardware was capable of, especially internally on our database systems. And because of that, it made a lot of sense to own our own infrastructure and put it in a data center that we managed, so that we had complete control over the whole environment. Whether it's still working out fine for us now, and I don't know of any plans to change that, but certainly the advent and the rise of the cloud, the rise of infrastructure as a service, means that certainly for the next 2, 5, 10 years, we'll be constantly looking at that as a model and working out, okay, does it make sense at some point to transition this over to a hosted model as well? There's no plans to do it now, but certainly we're always evaluating. And that's an important thing to note, is you're always just questioning and making sure you're doing the best thing. Any other questions?
Starting a new game today, I don't know which module I would go, but like in a huge company like this, because it's kind of gotten huge, then it makes sense to own part of the infrastructure.
I mean, to do this today, it would make a lot of sense to just provision a bunch of stuff in the cloud. It's really flexible. You can get it in 5 minutes, and you can get up and running. And this is what a lot of startups are doing. There's a lot of kind of articles online at the moment about looking at the kind of time to market for a software or a tech product. In that, these infrastructure services now just have everything you need to run a web service and scale it reasonably well. I mean, you look at companies like Netflix and Instagram, which are just completely on Amazon, and they're operating at just prodigious scale.
So I do operations primarily. So my organization is getting to this point where DevOps is looking a little bit more attractive to me. How do you overcome that legacy corporate culture, and what challenges were inherent in that move to something like DevOps? So
to overcome the kind of legacy culture, it requires a couple of things. It requires some people to read and understand what is possible. And again, it's this question, what is possible? Getting the concept into people's minds that something different is possible, and possibly better than what you're doing now, and kind of a bit of technical knowledge to back that up. But ultimately, the first step in an organization going here, and this is certainly the experience within CCP, is that it requires a couple of people to really champion and sell the idea within the company. You need to get people behind it. If people are behind it, then looking at the actual tech, looking at the specific tools that you might use to achieve those goals becomes possible. But the most important thing, certainly for CCP, having seen this happen, is that there were, just a few people within the company that really just said, hey, this is not right. It's not right that we're just drowning in manually configuring our services. It's not right, and I'm starting to see this stuff online that people are doing this a different way. Let's read this stuff. Let's look at it. Can we do it ourselves? And without those champions, it probably wouldn't have happened. So that's the first step, I would say. And it's important to know that DevOps is not like a tool. It's not a piece of software. It's not a product. It is a corporate philosophy. It is something that the company has to embrace from the kind of the management down, is that it's putting developers into places where they can interact directly with operations and affect the way operations do their day-to-day job. And similarly, putting operations guys into the development cycle, not necessarily permanently even, but just having them there, aware of what's going on and helping influence decisions that are made during the release and the planning process.
So what really happened within CCP was that, like us, the cluster tech developers, we decided, yeah, let's take this one guy that is really good in this and just like put him to the side and let him create a prototype of how we do this. Like after a while, Otter was like his own team creating DevOps, and like because we had this functioning and we needed some of it, then operations came along and just like took it.
Yes, please.
Yeah, because like, hey, this is actually working. We should use this to deploy to our servers. So that's a really good adoption model. Just like get someone to prototype something and then get it into production.
Yeah.
Prototype.
Yeah, I know another guy that did a lot of this completely outside of CCP, a guy I went to school with, and he did a lot of just a lot of work scripting things. That was all he ever did. He basically took some small part of his job and scripted it and made it automated. And then suddenly, instead of working really hard 5 days a week, he was working really hard 1 day a week and doing a lot of reading and posting on forums. And going from there, the company then kind of realized, wow, actually, this is a really cool way of doing things. And if everyone did this, then we'd be able to focus on our core business a lot more.
So it sounds like you guys are taking the steps towards doing this sort of in big data style, where you have to think about the systems in bulk, in aggregate. You're not just watching over the metrics over an individual box. You end up having to store the data. You have to be able to walk through it quickly to aggregate it, to be able to have it tell you useful things. Any war stories about building up to this setup? And also, if you guys are doing this a lot for the game, did you find it was just not a big deal to move down to, oh, okay, we'll just get number of packets transmitted per second for every box. We were already doing every battle, every shot in the game, so it was easy? Or did you find you weren't doing that and it was a learning experience?
Certainly, there's a lot of learning
great
there.
question for next year.
Yeah, there's certainly going to be a lot of learning in that landscape now. But what I will say is that our initial go at this is kind of like we've put the infrastructure in place and we've started to query the data that we have, and now we're at the point where we're circling that back around into the development cycle and saying, okay, guys, this is the information that you can get now from this kind of system. We've built a system that can take it, so let's now come back around and say, what do you want to see? Like, we can show you how many meters your character has run in Dust. We can query that, and it takes just a very small amount of time to get that piece of information across a huge set of data. Is that what you want, or what would you like to see? And then it's just a case of, okay, so we have some people that are getting more and more familiar with the analytics side of this. We've got guys that are working more in that kind of data science field, and they are assisting the development team in kind of formulating the data in a way that can then be queried when it comes back into the Hadoop cluster.
Hadoop cluster.
Oh, I used that word.
Yes.
Yeah.
I use it a lot in my day job, usually to curse it, but anyway.
Yeah, and I mean that's the other thing. That whole concept of big data is still really new and really it's moving a lot. There's a lot of companies coming out. There's a lot of startups. There's a lot of people packaging the concept in different ways. There's even a lot of new companies coming out saying Hadoop's great if you're huge, but here's something that's mid-range. And so,
and then there's always the question of how up to date do you want to be? Do you want to do it like continuously, or do you want to do it in batch jobs afterwards? Like that's
there's a lot of that's actually a really good point to raise. Is that there is that question of how what is the goal, like to pick the system. Like you can't really just go and say, okay, I want a Hadoop cluster, which is what we did first. But that experience has led us to realize it's actually probably really good to ask the question, like, what technology will let me do X? Like, what technology will let me find out this piece of information live? Or what technology will let me run a batch job for an hour and then compute these statistics? And the answer to that is that there's a lot of different technology out there.
And then there's also, will this thing survive with our growth rate in a year? If
yes,
not,
exactly.
we go for it.
And so then you've got questions like, okay, how much data am I going to be logging? What is the retention policy that I want? Do I want a month of data? Do I want 6 months of data, or do I want it forever?
Thanks.
So, more questions?
I think we're almost out of time, which is amazing.
Almost.
Almost. Got time for one or two more if there are any.
You guys can always grab us and talk to us.
Now that we've actually done this, we're going to be able to like wander around Fanfest now. Yes, is the answer to that.
Yes.
We will be pub crawling. I'm not officially on a group, but
we weren't allowed to get a group, which means that people know us in this company.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming, guys. I hope it was interesting for you and informative. And just grab us if you've got any questions or you want to get even further into the nuts and bolts of this stuff.